Hello everyone. Today I'd like to talk about something that many visitors notice when they enter a Vietnamese home for the first time. Maybe you have seen a small altar placed in the living room or in the most respected area of the house. And on the altar, there are usually family photos, flowers, fruits, cups of tea, and incense. And when foreign visitors see this, they often ask me, is this a religious altar? Well, the answer is yes and no. There may be some religious influences, but for most Vietnamese people, this tradition is really about family, gratitude, and remembering where we come from. So today, let's take a closer look at the ancestor worship and why it remains such an important part of Vietnamese culture. And to understand this tradition, we first need to understand how Vietnamese society developed. You know, for thousands of years, Vietnam was an agricultural country. Most people lived in villages and worked on rice farms. Back then, families were usually much larger than now, and it was common to have grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes even great-grandparents living together in the same house. Because of that, family relationships became extremely important. People depended on one another, not only emotionally, but also economically. Everyone worked together and supported each other. And over time, respect for parents and grandparents became one of the most important values in Vietnamese culture. And eventually, that respect continued even after family members passed away. That is where ancestor worship began. Now, when people hear the phrase ancestor worship, they sometimes misunderstand it. Some people think Vietnamese people are worshipping spirits, but actually, we don't see it that way. If you ask a local person why they have an ancestor altar, they will probably give you a very simple answer, that because I want to remember my parents and my grandparents. So for many families, the altar is a way of saying thank you to previous generations. And there is a famous Vietnamese saying, when drinking water, remember its source. It means that whenever we enjoy something today, we should remember the people who made it possible. Maybe your grandparents worked hard to build a family, or maybe your parents sacrificed many things to raise their children. So the ancestor worship is a way of expressing gratitude to those efforts. And another interesting thing is how Vietnamese people traditionally think about death. In many cultures, death is often seen as a final goodbye. But in traditional Vietnamese thinking, the relationship between family members doesn't completely end when someone dies. Of course, the person is no longer physically present, but their memory remains, their teachings remain, their influence remains, and in many ways, they are still considered part of the family. That's why Vietnamese people often talk about their grandparents or the great-grandparents even many years after they have passed away. The ancestors are gone, but they are not forgotten. This idea can be seen very clearly through the ancestor altar. In many Vietnamese homes, the ancestor altar is one of the most respected places in the house, so it's usually placed in the higher position and kept clean and tidy. You may see photos of family members who have passed away along with flowers, fruit, tea, and incense. And the altar is not viewed as a place of sadness, it's more like a place of remembrance. A place where people can pause for a moment and think about the generations that came before them. And one thing visitors always notice is the incense. You will often see Vietnamese people lighting incense and standing quietly in front of the altar. At first, foreigners sometimes think that they are praying for something. Actually, sometimes they are, but very often they are simply expressing their gratitude or sharing important family news. For example, before a wedding, many families will inform their ancestors about the upcoming marriage. Or before moving into a new house, they may light incense and pay their respects. Or during important milestones in their life, people often return to the family altar first. So it's a way of keeping previous generations involved in the family's journey. And the most important time of year for ancestor worship is definitely Tết, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. If you ever visit Vietnam during Tết, you will see families cleaning and decorating their altars. Special food is prepared, fresh flowers is displayed, or fruit is carefully arranged, and everyone gathers together to welcome the new year. For many Vietnamese people, Tết is not only about spending time with the living, it's also about remembering family members who are no longer here. So, in a symbolic way, the entire family is reunited during the holiday. And besides that, there is another important tradition closely connected to ancestor worship in Vietnam. It is called a death anniversary or đám giỗ in Vietnamese. You know, unlike birthdays, which celebrate the day a person was born, a death anniversary is a day when family members gather to remember the loved one who has passed away. For many Vietnamese families, this tradition is extremely important. Every year, on the anniversary of a parent's, grandparents, or ancestor passing, relatives often return home from different cities to gather together. The family prepares food, lights incense, and pays respect at the ancestor altar. And after the ceremony, everyone usually sits down and shares a meal together. And you know what interesting is that a death anniversary in Vietnam is not usually a sad occasion. Of course, people remember the person who has passed away, but the atmosphere is often warm and meaningful rather than sorrowful. At that time, family members usually share stories, talk about old memories, and remember the contributions that person made to the family. So in many ways, the gathering helps people keep their family connections strong. For the older generations, it's an opportunity to teach the younger family members about their roots and family history. And for younger generations, it's a chance to meet relatives, hear family stories, and better understand where they come from. So, while ancestor worship helps people connect the living with the previous generations, the death anniversary helps them keep those memories alive from one generation to the next. And that's one of the reasons why many Vietnamese people continue to maintain this tradition even in modern life. And another thing that surprises many visitors is that ancestor worship is not limited to one religion. You can find ancestor altars in Buddhist families, Catholic families, families that follow folk beliefs, and even families that don't actively practice any religion. This is because most Vietnamese people see ancestor worship primarily as a family tradition rather than a religious obligation. So no matter what religion they follow, many people still want to remember and honor their parents and grandparents. And you know, ancestor worship in Vietnam goes beyond individual families. It also exists in the national level. Every year, Vietnamese people commemorate the Hùng kings, who are considered the legendary founders of the Vietnamese nation. This celebration is known as Hùng Kings Commemoration Day or Giỗ Tổ Hùng Vương. At that day, millions of people visit the Hùng Temple in Phu Thọ province and pay their respects. This reflects an important idea of Vietnamese culture. Vietnamese people not only honor the ancestors of their families, but also the ancestors of the nation. And in fact, the worship of Hùng kings was recognized by the UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity in 2012. And another reason why this tradition remains strong today is because It helps the Vietnamese people preserve the family values. Vietnamese culture places a strong emphasis on respect, responsibility, and gratitude. When children grow up seeing their parents honor their grandparents or ancestors, so they can learn the importance of the family connection. They learn that life is not only about themselves, but they are part of the larger family story. The story that began long before they were born and will continue long after they are gone. And now, Vietnam today is very modern. Many young people live in apartments. Many people work in the large cities. And some people study overseas or build international careers. Life is changing quickly. But if you visit most Vietnamese homes, you will still find an ancestor altar somewhere inside. Maybe it's large or maybe it's small, but it's usually there. And I think that tells us something very important. No matter how much society changes, Vietnamese people still place great value on family, gratitude, and remembering their roots. So, what does ancestor worship really mean in Vietnam? For me, it comes down to one simple idea. Never forget the people who helped you become who you are today. That's why Vietnamese people continue this tradition generation after generation. It's not really about fear. It's not really about superstition. It's about family. It's about gratitude. And it's about remembering that none of us arrive here completely on our own. We all stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. And perhaps that's the most important meaning behind ancestor worship in Vietnam. Thank you for listening.